for the people and communities that we're focused on. I am not going to introduce Dennis. That is going to be the job of Nan Roman, who needs no introduction, but if you care about homelessness, you know Nan. And we just ask you to take your seats, and I'm partly signaling out to the hall, time to come on back. I could jump up and down, but that would be problematic. So I see the bodies moving in this direction. So Nan, I think you should go ahead. Thank you.
Well, hi, I'm Nan Roman. I'm the president of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm really happy to have a couple minutes here just today to introduce Dennis, my very good friend Dennis Culhane. I had to bring the paper up so that I could remember all of his titles. Co-principal investigator, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, also the Stone Chair of Social Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Director of Research at the National Center for Homelessness Among Veterans. So when homelessness first started to emerge, or after it had, I guess, started to emerge in the 90s, we all thought that that all homeless people were basically the stereotype that we see now, single adults who were mentally ill and had substance abuse issues living on the street. And then this fellow from the University of Pennsylvania came along who had gotten a hold of the administrative data from New York City and Philadelphia on homeless people and analyzed the single adults and came up with a typology that showed us that actually the people that fit that stereotype were not the majority of homeless people. They were the minority of homeless individuals, people who stayed homeless for long periods of time and had disabilities, used the majority of the resources in the homeless system and a lot of resources in other systems, and were the chronic people that we now call chronically homeless. That changed our entire view of what to do about homelessness in the country. He then went on to use administrative data, comparing homelessness or merging homelessness administrative data with administrative data from other, 5 or 6 other systems in New York City to look at the cost of leaving these chronically homeless people on the street and up against the cost of solving their problem with permanent supportive housing, showing the cost effectiveness of that. And now, a year or two later, we have half the number of chronically homeless people. I'm sure many of you, certainly from the Housing Authority side, engaged in ending chronic homelessness in your communities, and over 300,000 units of permanent supportive housing in the country. So Dennis has been incredibly influential in the homelessness arena, really changed our approach, as I said, to the issue, and he has moved on now to take on many other social issues. He has a knack that is sadly a little unique in many researchers of using the information, understanding the impact of the information on policy and practice. That's also been terribly important. So I know you're going to enjoy hearing about his new work in this field and how it may apply to what you're concerned on. Dennis?
Well, thank you to Nan. I certainly can't take anywhere near the credit she's giving for all that's happened in the homelessness area, because you probably know that the National Alliance has just been incredible at being successful on getting the people on both sides of the aisle, both parts of Congress, to agree to fund all sorts of important and innovative programs. But their commitment to research and to evidence-based policymaking has been critical. I think that if you went back 20 years in the homelessness space, homeless advocates are highly distrusted. I think you go back to, although wonderful, impassioned people, but when Mitch Snyder certainly put a high bar in terms of activism, but the decision makers expect the advocates to say certain things, and they don't always expect to hear from them that what they're really advocating for is not just an unrealizable number or something that doesn't really actually fit the reality, but fits expectations and is shaped by what the evidence actually says. So I think that's been a hallmark of the Alliance's success. And to the extent that some of the research that my team and I have been able to put together has been helpful in that regard, it's really gratifying. I did not intend on becoming an expert in administrative data. That was definitely not my plan. I came from a homelessness advocacy background. I worked as a community organizer. I worked first for the Coalition for the Homeless in Massachusetts, and then I was a community organizer among young adults who were homeless. And then got into this research because I realized that administrative data, instead of the typical research project, which was a census-like approach, which gives you the snapshot of the population, administrative data gave you the documentary film version of the problem. And that's a vastly different picture and a lot more information. And so that was a goal when I first started at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 90s, was to see if I could identify data sources that did that. And I was lucky to discover that New York and Philadelphia had such systems. They were the only two jurisdictions in the country that did that. They did it because they reimbursed their shelters per bed, per occupied bed per night, and they had to have a system to keep track of all those payments. That's the reason they did it. They didn't do it for research purposes. Most administrative data are not collected for research purposes. And so that's often why they're dismissed in some quarters. However, over the next 20 years, I spent most of my career linking the homeless records with other systems, everything from birth records to death records, HIV, Medicaid, you name it, and through that process ended up becoming expert in legal agreements, the memoranda of understanding, the data storage requirements, the many, many ins and outs and some data sources require you to be on site to do the analysis. Some require different encryptions. I mean, there are many, many, many rules. So I worked over the last 10 years with a colleague of mine, John Fantuzzo, who's in the Graduate School of Education. He's early education and I'm homelessness, so it's kind of a good fit for your earlier presentations, which are early education and homelessness. And he and I accidentally met at a Children and Families Cabinet meeting in Philadelphia when Mayor Ed Rendell was in charge there. And all of the agencies sat around and they wanted to figure out what's something that they could do collectively as a group of agencies that was within a year or two horizon, where they could form some partnerships and get something done. And one agreement was they could share data. And that had never been really done systematically before. So John and I worked with the members of that cabinet to create a memorandum of understanding across all the agencies, and we built a thing that came to be known as the Kids Integrated Data System, the acronym being KIDS. And it includes the school district data and all of the departmental data under Health and Human Services. We initially focused on 0 to 5, and then John, being the early childhood advocate, said early childhood goes to 8. We went to 0 to 8, and then we expanded up to all kids in school, and then eventually all adults in the city of Philadelphia eventually as well. So, and then the city incorporated this system in around 2007 so that we didn't have to do it anymore. They realized it had such value for their work and the things that they did that they incorporated it, which was a great relief for us because we were otherwise having to raise the money for that all the time. So, but in any event, the MacArthur Foundation and Erica Pothig, who is here, I know she was sitting over there before, as a program officer, approached us about whether we could look around the country to see what was going on that looked like that. Were there other states or counties or universities that had built these integrated data systems? And so for the last 8 years, my colleague John Fantuzzo and I have led this effort called Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, which is a professional network of states, counties, and universities that have linked these administrative records and are using them to drive decisions and policies. And so we've recently published a book by the same title. We have a new phase of the work which we're undertaking, which I'll mention briefly, but it's been a very interesting and exciting prospect to learn from these great minds of all these folks all around the country who've been doing this stuff, very much, in many cases, no one even knowing about it, and doing such important and valuable work. And it is important and valuable because so much is wrong. So much is broken. I think about the enterprise about generating knowledge and trying to get actual knowledge and research inserted into the policy-making process, and it's a fundamentally broken system. You have researchers who, have to toil away, and the information just never gets there in time. And if you don't go fast enough, it doesn't work. You don't go fast enough, you can't ride a bike. There's a certain speed at which you have to be going in order to sustain and actually make something happen. And in the world of policy analysis and research, very often it is going too slow, and it's a broken process. Instead, what substitutes for knowledge, what substitutes for information to inform decision making is the budget process. Okay, the budget process has to occur every year. It's a train that has to leave the station. The money has to be spent. The contracts have to be done. The dollars have to be committed. And so instead of actually having a thoughtful, deliberative process about what we're doing and what we're doing wrong, what we should be doing right, instead, the dictates of the budget cycle actually drive almost all of the decision making. And so things keep getting done over and over again, even when we know they don't work. We're not actually having a reflective practice about that. And the data collection part of the process turns out, everyone, of course, thinks data's great. We all want data. We all want more information. But if you ask the people on the field who are actually doing the delivery of these services, it's just another rote task that they have to do. They're collecting this information. They're doing their job. They have to record what they've done, and then they have to report that up, and then they start it all over again. It's not a process that informs what they're doing. It's not meaningful to the decisions they have to make on a daily basis. So that budget cycle thinking, which becomes kind of thoughtless and mindless, gets translated into the practice realm, where our activities become thoughtless and mindless regarding the information we're collecting. And if you're not collecting information that people care about, or that you care about, the person who's collecting it, then you're not going to actually get very good information in the end. So we have a lot of things out there, things happening and moving, but it's not being done in a reflective way. So part of what it's informed us in putting together this actionable intelligence for social policy was to try to understand where those breakdowns are occurring in the process, where and when, if you actually inserted, things that would solve some of the problems in the lineup of information and data, what would it look like? So one of the things as I say, we're going back to the fact of the time inconsistency. We're out of sync. There's an out of sync process because the executives who run these agencies need the information yesterday. It's so important, it has to be, and then the researchers are saying, well, we'll get it to you tomorrow because we actually never can give you an answer that we'll stand with. And then the people in the field need the information today. So this is a little cartoon to illustrate, again, the problem. And we have very important, significant social problems. We have lots of infrastructure of information that's being gathered about them. There is a tremendous amount of asset, if you will, unused asset in all of this. We have smart people who have lots of important statistical tools and knowledge. We have practitioners who care, who are out there and dealing with people every day, who know what's going on. And yet, none of these people really ever seem to get into the room together and have a thoughtful conversation. So that's part of the problem. But what we're trying to say and intervene and suggest that this actionable intelligence is a data dialogue due process that is ongoing, where information is on the table and brought as part of a dialogue that is among the stakeholders, the knowing community and the doing community, or as my friend says, the know-it-alls and the do-it-alls, because in each community there are those. But getting them into the space together so that executives are actually being informed about what the information and practice world are experiencing and seeing. And so how does that happen? Well, one of the biggest problems in social policy is the process, the sausage-making process that ends up with legislation then very much becomes cement. You get a law passed, then you get regulations issued. The regulations that get translated into what kind of contracts get written, the contracts get written, and they got data collection requirements, and then there's an audit trail that has to be associated with that in terms of collecting the information. It's not a pliable process. And it's almost designed with the expectation that the people who made this law actually had really good, almost perfect knowledge when they put their solution together. Now, of course, if they were wrong, which of course they are very often, that means that what's wrong gets carried on all the time. There's not a trial and error process, and we don't have a culture where we think within social programs and in government about that we understand we're not going to be right. And that not being right the first time and getting things wrong is completely not only acceptable, it's expected. But we're also going to be engaged in a process that is a trial and error process. You know, Alexander Graham Bell did not come out with a smartphone, right? And didn't even come out with a working phone initially. You have to have a lot of processes that are designed, and the most important thing, there's inventors there's a lot of famous quotes about this where, you know, failure is your most important friend, because it's by learning that something's not working that you're going to actually get to the answer. And in social policy, it's no different. If we want to get the solution that works and listen to the people we're serving, listen to all, it's going to take time, it's going to take lots of course corrections, and we have to have a system in place that's not, we do have a system for generating knowledge that I think of like the NIH, the National Institute of Health kind of model, and the big research model that universities typically do, where, you know, somehow some advocacy group or someone in government decides we need to know this, and they put out an RFP, and then, you know, 500 people are followed for a 5-year period at the cost of $3 million, and 7 years later you get the answer. Okay, you get an answer about that. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, well, thanks for telling us. Okay, you know, and meanwhile, the budget train has left the station 7 times, and it's been changed. There's other things going on, and the issue that mattered when they put that out there, the people that cared are no longer there. The issue isn't anymore on the table. Everything has changed. That process, that model also isn't working. So administrative data, the reason I champion administrative data is because it has the potential to completely change the paradigm for how we engage in social policy, programming, and innovation. Because administrative data are already there, they're very low cost, and by bringing them together, you can drive down the cost and increase the speed of innovation. So you're not just riding a bike, you can actually do tricks, as our little cartoon here is, okay? So that's the idea. And integrated data systems are basically the combination of these administrative systems. So instead of just looking within one sector, like within the Housing Authority's data set, or within the school district's data set, or the Child Welfare Agency's data set, you actually try to pull all that stuff together, okay? And the focus no longer has to be about what's happening in that program and the performance of that program, but what's happening to this person. What's happening in the lives of the people we're dealing with, what's happening within families. All of these things that are hugely important, that if you're just slicing it and seeing it from the perspective of the agency that has its dollar, its expenditure, its report, you're getting just such a tiny, tiny piece of that information. So these integrated data systems are kind of a wonderful gold mine of information that gets put together. And when I talk to communities, actually when you talk to anyone, you talk to average person in my neighborhood, they can't believe that we're not already doing this, because they watch too many of those TV crime shows where we just got to find me the last 5 people discharged from the hospital who also had a divorce and have a kid, and they're at 45, 60, they think that it works that way, and of course it doesn't. But you would be surprised how very little effort is going into bringing these data together when the potential of what they have it becomes more known to you. So the typical integrated data system has these kinds of information: child welfare, health, mental health, substance abuse, and education, justice programs, workforce earnings. So not just all the bad stuff, because I remember when we first got started in these data, everything was bad: incarceration, child abuse, neglect, juvenile justice detention, and there were no flowers growing in the garden, and he walks kids across the street, or he helps out with the But with education and workforce, we get positive information because achievement. People achieve, they graduate, they get jobs, there's positive information, and that's been really important to these systems, has been able to bring in particular, education, workforce, and earnings data. So, just to give you a little idea of how much information is potentially available through these sources, I'm just going to take you a little bit through the life cycle so you can envision sort of the book of life as it emerges from you're a baby and born, and of course you get that vital first piece of information, vital statistics, birth record. Has your mother's name on it, her education level, smoking or not smoking, number of prenatal care visits, birth weight, low birth weight, whether there was a unintended negative birth event during the birth, the father's name since 1996, in 99% of the cases, the father's name is on there as well. So you get a lot of information from the birth certificate. We get also a social security number, which is going to be very important for tracking you through a lot of these sources over time. Eventually, you're getting an immunization record that has to be complete, usually before you're allowed and admitted into school. In some communities, there is good early childhood data, but it's not often. But you do, and certainly in some communities, get the city or district-run Head Start programs. You get school attendance and achievement. There's standardized test scores that are available. There is, within the school records, of course, the heights and the weights and the speech and the hearing and the special education data, which are recorded on an annual basis, or at least every couple years. Transportation, I know in Philadelphia's case, this turned out to be really important because 65% of the kids go to public school. Where do you get the other 35%? Transportation, because every school, private and parochial, has to submit their names of their kids, and it goes into the transportation database because there's school busing. So you end up with transportation, gets you, of course, location information. You can get some after-school data about kids and what programs they're in and athletics and things. The after-school program known as detention or suspensions, expulsions, all of these things that are recorded in the school record. We also, of course, for families with kids in foster care, we have abuse and neglect. All of that data is captured in childhood. And the transition to adulthood, we have college attendance, public colleges and universities, private universities and state colleges. There's other workforce programs like Job Corps and vocational rehabilitation and WIA, and all those workforce programs, and there's military enrollment, of course. And then in adulthood, we get less data, but certainly consistent information. People in other adult workforce programs, there's employment, the earnings records that are recorded, usually at the state level. There's participation in public assistance programs and SNAP. And then there's healthcare data because, at least with respect to any emergency room visit or inpatient hospitalization, there's a statewide data set that, regardless of the payer, Medicaid, private pay, whatever, it's recorded in the all-payer database. And then, of course, when people become parents, the birth certificate will indicate that they are parenting. And then into adulthood, we also have, as people age, and there's special populations, people with disabilities that are of particular interest, folks who are homeless or who spend time in state or local prisons. We have data which are tracking that, probation, all of these data are captured. And then lastly, as people age, you get retirement information in terms of Social Security, people who are going into assisted living or in old age facilities, and Medicare data. And then lastly, the death certificate, which records cause of death, contributing causes of death, and next of kin and location. Okay, so you get lots of pieces of information. So you could say this is sort of your digital life story, your digital double, if you will. And so these are data which, as I said, are already being collected, so it's important to realize, and they're clearly sensitive pieces of information, because these are, you're a person, you're a patient, you're a social service client, you're a taxpayer, you're a student. These are all protected by lots of different legal statutes, and those all have to be taken into consideration. But from a research and analysis perspective, there's some very important advantages relative to traditional social science projects, okay? They're population-based. It's not just samples. So you're not just capturing people, who are responding to a survey, which a lot of our knowledge base these days is derived from surveys where response rates are 20 and 25%. So these are population-based. As I mentioned, there's low to no cost for the data collection. There is a cost to the integration of these, but it's really a marginal, nickels on the dollar kind of cost. And of course, linkable at the individual level, which is very powerful. So you're following the same individuals across these agencies and over time. Some of these systems that we work with have been around for 25 years and can follow people from the birth certificate well into their adulthood. And you're getting all these key domains that are of public policy relevance, because these data are typically tracking the expenditures of these agencies, that where their dollars are going and what they're doing. So unlike a lot of research where folks will try to be policy relevant, these data are immediately policy relevant to the agencies because they're tracking where their expenditures are. I'm going to give you just a few examples, briefly, one slide each for them, just to give you an idea. This is the one that Nan alluded to, which was a project we did in New York City. And we had about 10,000 people that we tracked, all of whom were chronically homeless with a severe mental illness. Half of them got into housing, half of them did not. The blue bars here indicate what their use of services was across these 8 different domains in the 2 years before they got into the housing. And as you can see, these folks were significant users of shelters, psych hospitals, municipal hospitals, Medicaid-paid general hospitals, VA, prison, jail. And so pre-housing, they were using an average of $40,000 per person per year. That's per person per year. Multiply that times 10,000 people, okay, over a decade of when these data were being tracked. And at the end of that year of $40,000, these folks were still homeless. Okay, so all of those resources being spent and managing homelessness. And if we didn't have these data, we would not have been able to sort of get this on the radar screen. These folks would have just been people we saw, but had no idea that, and in fact, if you look at it on a daily basis, these folks were in a publicly reimbursed service almost every 3 days. They, someone was paying on average something $40 to $60 per person every few days. And then the orange reflects what happened for the people who got into the housing and how much they reduced their use of those services. So after the housing, they reduced their use of those services to $24,000. So just to give you an idea from an efficiency perspective, in contrast to that NIH type project I mentioned where you track 500 people and it takes 5 years, we tracked 10,000 people over 10 years of data, and it took us 2 years from start to finish for this project. It shouldn't even have taken that long, but it did. And it cost us $200,000, okay? And it shouldn't even cost that much, okay? But at that time, that was what the price. So that's a pretty powerful use case to be able to track that many people across all those systems at a relatively low cost and pretty quickly, okay? I'll give you an example. One of the other things that's happening now is these pay-for-success projects or pay-for-performance. There's a whole field evolving around how do you bring innovation into social policy? How can you encourage experimentation, randomized controlled trials embedded in everyday practice of government? And so one example that has been used is people randomly assigning communities to getting some kind of intervention. So you could imagine in this particular case a juvenile justice intervention trying to avert adult incarceration and improve adult outcomes, and you could then track them through the college achievement and attendance data, tracking them through the earnings data, and looking in the adult incarceration records, and then one researcher in Harrisburg can be pulling these data together and see in real time whether this program is having an impact at 6, 12, 18 months and on into a 2 or 3 year period. An example of a project like that we did a study, this is an observational study in Los Angeles, another place where there's one of these integrated data systems. We followed all the young people who were emancipating out of foster care and juvenile justice, okay, who aged out of those systems, and included a group who actually went from foster care into juvenile justice and then aged out. Okay, so they're called the crossover group. So we had juvenile probation, we had child welfare exiters, and we had the crossover group. And we did in this project, we said, where are they at age 25? What's happened to these kids 7 years later with regard to all these adult outcomes that are listed here in terms of incarceration and public assistance and use of mental health, behavioral health, etc. And so this is just one slide from that study, and you can see, one of the unfortunate impacts we saw was the huge rates of adult incarceration for the folks from both the juvenile justice system and the crossover group. But I remember a whole bunch of different studies. I think one of the things we found, or statistics from this, I think we found that the average person was using $16,000 a year in services across all these systems, okay? And that about 25% of the group was using 70+% of all the services. A relatively small group that could have been targeted. I mean, it would have been cheaper, even with all the false positives, to possibly target a group with housing subsidies and a subsidized job than to have them be going into adult incarceration and all these other negative outcomes. So that really suggested a machine learning kind of project of going back and doing what are the predictive analytics of who goes into which trajectory of here. But this is another project, just to give you a sense of the scale. We followed 23,000 kids over an 8-year period. It took us 18 months to do the project from start to end. And again, it was about $200,000 that we spent on that. So our network, this Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, now is comprised of these jurisdictions. So we have New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles, so 4 of the 5 largest communities, urban communities in the country. States like Washington State, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, South Carolina. We have communities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh with respect to Cuyahoga County and Allegheny County. State of Rhode Island recently has joined this effort. Mecklenburg County, Charlotte has recently joined the effort. So all total, 26% of the U.S. population is actually being tracked in an integrated data system at this point. And we think that there's the potential to expand this pretty substantially. We have this, right now under formation, we have the states of Virginia and New Jersey and Hawaii that are building systems. And so there's a lot of interest and potential in going forward. I think I'll stop there. I have other slides about a new project. We're trying to advance this work, and it could maybe come up in the question and answers, and I can say something more about it. But any questions that folks might have? Yes? I'm from Washington. How do you access? So, good question. So one of the problems is access. Even though these systems exist, a lot of times, unless you have some fancy institutional connection, like you're at Harvard or MIT or something, and with the big, federal grant, it's very tough to get access to these systems. The systems tend to be used, in some cases, very much just for the internal processes and decision-makings of those entities. So part of what we've been doing as a group is looking at what are the kind of ethical procedures. What's the obligation of government to be more transparent about access to the data and how to share results in a way, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of political sensitivities if something is found that makes the decision makers or the politicians look bad. And they don't, or even the data owners don't want people to know that the job they've been doing for 15 years with this data set and it looks like junk inside, So there has to be a sort of an ethic, around the governance of this work that promotes transparency but also has appropriate protections against the, gotcha kind of research projects that could be done. So there's a balance there that has to be carried out, and many of our communities have solved that balance and have an ethos that's very much about pushing the data out. I would say Allegheny County is one of the ones out there that's really committed to making these data available, and they have a research version of their data set that they make available for people who want to access it. Philadelphia is about to create one of those. Our new project that I was going to mention is building a machine basically that would enable broader access as well. So it's something that is being worked on.
Social Security card. Do you have access to either Social Security data, which would be a way to get income during the earning years, and the IRS could?
So right now, the primary way people get earnings data is through their state unemployment insurance file, because state governments collect the unemployment insurance benefit information in cash from employers. However, there's some holes there. It does not capture federal employees. It does not capture military as a part of federal employees. It doesn't capture employees who are working out of state. Like, so if you're in Philadelphia and you get Pennsylvania's, you're not capturing people working in New Jersey or in Delaware. So you can still do lots with what you've got, and but recognizing the limitations. But there is a process afoot right now that the Census Bureau has been funded this year with a $10 million appropriation from the Congress to create an infrastructure to enable them to potentially become the site where states and local governments and researchers working with them can submit data to be linked up behind the census firewall. Because Census, under their unique constitutional authority, has the ability to acquire federal data sets and to store them. Now, their purpose is supposed to be for improving the decennial census count. So they are seeking new authority, and there's a new Evidence-Based Policy Commission that's been formed. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but there's a new Evidence-Based Policy Commission that's been formed by the Congress to make recommendations to the Congress about legal changes that would enable things like this to occur. In fact, Census Bureau is managing that commission and staffing it. And so they have the Social Security data set. They have the IRS data set. They have the National Student Clearinghouse data set. So you could get the national data by doing that. So there's an effort to do that, yeah.
Dennis, extreme importance and interest to this group, specifically around housing education, the project that you're working on that uses these integrated data systems to look at academic outcomes for our assisted students. Can you talk a little bit about that project and methodology?
So we have 5 of the jurisdictions here, states and a couple locals, governments, where we linked up so what we did was years ago, met with Erica when she was at HUD at that time and talked about, HUD did not have a procedure in place for sharing the tenant data with researchers or with these integrated data systems. So under Erica's pushing, it finally got done, and now there's a new data licensing agreement process in place from HUD where you can license the data, that's the mechanism they've created, and you can store it and link it in these databases. Your permission has to give you broad authority for what you're going to be looking at. But we did that under this process, and we have the school districts in these states and these communities partnered, and we've brought the data together. So we used our integrated data systems for these sites, and we have the results will be coming out soon with regard to the outcomes. The outcomes are not as positive as we had hoped in terms of we looked at the differential impact of assisted households versus students just like the assisted household students in the same schools and what their attendance, achievement, and other outcomes were. And it was not as good as we would have liked. And but what's very useful is some of our sites were able to bring in the child welfare, juvenile justice, and other data sources in, and it's really creating a richer picture, like in Washington State. Yeah, so we are seeing the potential there, and it's a good baseline to look at if there's new interventions started, what could be the value add based on what we are observing. Yes, sir.
You talked about the data linking potential around Culhane, and parent tracking.
So that's hugely of great interest is families and being able to connect children to adults. And through the birth certificate, you can connect children to parents, okay? But that does not necessarily mean that people are living with those folks as well. So you can do certain level of analysis by connecting parent data from the birth certificate along with the child data, okay? And then doing that prospectively if you're doing some kind of intervention in a community. But you do have to be careful because there are a couple other sources where you can get what we call household roster data, right? And one of them is assisted households, so and housing assistance. So the HUD data has a roster where you can get the people who are in the household, which might include birth parents, but it might include non-birth parents, adults. So you can pick up folks there. Also, the SNAP data and the TANF data. So now these are not representative samples of the population, but they are three places where you get what we would call a household roster, where you could see everyone who's in that household. One of our sites is doing a very interesting project right now, which is looking at the impact of incarceration of a parent or adult in a household on the children in that household. And so essentially the way it was is we've started with the data set that had identified third graders and the whole household constellation from the public assistance records, and then followed over time to see when one of the adults there, parent or not parent, because it could be, ended up incarcerated, and then we tracked what's happening to the kids with regard to mental health services, school suspensions, expulsions, etc. So that's a very interesting project that's going on, but yeah. Yes?
So, if we're doing a small program saying, let's say that, your data comes out, housing and education, and I work with,
Subset.
nonprofit organizations, right? So we have, two somewhere, and they're trying to do an initiative, but, maybe they're touching 200 kids,
Right.
So then how do we take and look at, getting the data for those 200 kids to then compare to like, okay, that was our benchmark, we're doing better or worse? What's the best way to go about that?
So in the existing sites where they are now, some of them actually have relationships with nonprofit organizations where they do just that. They'll bring in after-school data, let's say, and look at the outcomes for kids who are in a certain program compared to others. Or in Mecklenburg County, they're bringing in all the United Way client-level data, which is commonly tracked through a certain system to give the providers information about all the kids that they're serving in aggregate, reports. And the project that I'm proposing we're undertaking right now is hopefully going to design a technology solution that would make it easier for you to bring in cohorts, match them up, and then generate a file which can give you aggregate statistics about those people who are matched up. So you could do your intervention and see, maybe you did your intervention 3 years ago, and now you want to say, hey, wonder what happened to them. How many of those kids graduated high school compared to a group that was matched to them? And that could be done. And that's mimicking a system that Medicaid and Medicare have in place as well right now. The Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services has a 25-year linked Medicaid-Medicare claims database. And if you're a researcher who studied some people with diabetes in 1995 or 2000, and you did an intervention with them, you can bring that data set in, they'll match it up, and they'll give you the entire treatment history of those folks up until 2013 right now. And then they put that into a researchable space where you can go in, you don't touch the data, but you can process statistical analyses on the data and get the results. So we're aiming to try to have that functionality. No legal questions. Oh, yes.
Describe the arrangements that keeping access to this confidential and identifiable information despite pretty strict statutes that include.
So, yes, exactly. Very important. It's the legal question. So basically what happens is that whether you're talking about FERPA or HIPAA or the Privacy Act or virtually any prevailing privacy rule, although in some states there are some specific protections like around things like HIV information or substance abuse treatment information that are even more tight. In general, there are exemptions in those laws, and certainly in the federal laws, there are exemptions or exceptions, whichever you want to call them, or routine uses that are permissible, which include auditing and evaluating programs. And it's under the auditing and evaluating activity that these records can be linked, because you're not just doing it to try to understand, a phenomenon. You're actually, your purpose has to be to try to evaluate or understand a program. And so there has to be a governance process. The memoranda of understanding, which are signed by, let's say, in LA County, there's 13 agencies who've signed this memorandum of understanding. That MOU spells out where the data is residing, what the data security is, the permitted uses, which there are no permitted uses without everybody at the table has to agree on use of their data for any given project, because the data holders have responsibility for making sure that it complies with the purposes. FERPA is an interesting one because it has to have an educational purpose, and that has to be understood. So not every project, you have to be able to figure out, okay, how is it that this could be used somehow to improve instruction for the student? And so that's the research exception or the evaluation exception. However, FERPA, by the way, the U.S. Department of Education is coming out with new guidance. We're told it's already written and it's in clearance and will be out soon, which is explicitly describes all of the auspices under which education records, school district at a local level or state level, can be stored in one of these integrated data systems and how they can be analyzed and compliant with FERPA. So there's new guidance coming out very specifically on that. So that might be helpful if you're dealing with school district data. Yes?
Is there a difference in the data that you're collecting on the city, county, and state level?
Yes. So it does matter whether you're at a local or state level. And cities, it turns out, they have less data than do the counties, generally speaking. Now, of course, some states don't really have counties as a very strong functional unit. Most states do have pretty strong counties as a functional unit that's capturing data. Sometimes they have to hand it up to the state. So it certainly matters in your state or county whether the state or the county is a better place to get the data. Interestingly, local governments tend not to have much other than school districts, and even the school districts tend to be controlled by a separate legal authority than the mayor or the city council. So school districts are also, unusual. But so our experience has been that cities are not great hubs for doing these integrated data systems, whereas counties tend to be much better because most of the health and human services data are done and administered through the county. And then, but then we see things like, I'll give you the example, Allegheny County, that's Pittsburgh. There are 14 school districts in Allegheny County. 7 of those school districts have agreements with the county where they send their data to the county, and the county then is able to tell the school districts at a school level what the profile is of their kids with regard to all of these various measures and outcomes. Okay? And then similarly, there are state systems like in South Carolina where the counties send their data up to the state, and the state has an agreement with them to push back to them certain pieces of information that they want. So there are all sorts of relationships like that go on.
I'm sorry. So what's the magic of it, in the sense of what brings people to the table?
Usually there is a galvanizing purpose. Someone somewhere has an initiative that they want to do. Early childhood, truancy, homelessness, special needs young people who are becoming adults. Usually there is a galvanizing purpose that gets people to the table. But there's also the case of a visionary leader who, like in Virginia, the head of Health and Human Services, just basically said, this is the right thing to do. I can't believe we're doing it. He got to the job. He's like, you mean we don't do this? And so he basically got everyone around, had a conference, and is forcing them to put it together. Then you also have, and then a third option is you have a lot of places where states have been through this, state agencies or county agencies, doing these data exchange agreements, data sharing agreements, and they know it takes 2 years every single time, and they're so tired of it, they say, let's once and for all come up with a single agreement, let's put it all together, and let's do it. So fatigue with doing it can sometimes bring people, but usually leadership is the most important thing. Someone who has a reason to, and is in the right position, a governor or a senior administrator who has an authority to get people to the table to do it. Yes?
Can you take that maybe one step further in a story about the people around the table breaking through the bicycle problem and the factory assembly line problem together by using it in an actionable way in a relatively short period? I don't know how long you've been going, or if you can just describe a situation where indeed it's turned out to be actionable.
Yeah, so we have a section on our website, aisp.upenn.edu, that has uses and illustrative use cases. We have had a number of projects. We did the early childhood one was that we did in Philadelphia, which identified we found that almost all the variants that predicted school achievement gaps by third grade were predicted by all these preschool exposures. And lead was number one, and maternal education was very high. Homelessness was a huge risk factor. So we ended up changing policy about homelessness in terms of how the shelters were complying or not with their McKinney obligations. I mean, one of the things is, people are supposed to be going to the school where they were before they became homeless. That does not happen in Philadelphia. There's no transportation for that. And people went to the school nearest the shelter. Then you end up with a shelter that has 30% of the kids are homeless. And a school desk is occupied by 5 different kids in the course of the year because they're only homeless for 60 days. So it had a very negative impact on that school. That policy we got changed. The home inspection for lead testing got changed as a result of that project. But generally, our experience has been, so a lot of projects go on because government needs to know, and there's agencies sharing information, and it supports operational and budget decision making. But when you think about solving a problem that matters to the public, usually there's like a blue ribbon commission kind of thing, so you get community stakeholders who are brought together, could be a foundation who gets people together, and so you have providers, you have government, and they are framing up the questions, and then they task the integrated data system with get us the answers, and then they take the answers and they say here's recommendations based on that go to the executive. I mean, that's a recipe for how to do the community problems and get them to an actionable place. But government, believe it or not, these places that are deeply embedded in government, they are doing, they could be doing 50 projects a year where they're just constantly informing decisions, but they're not things you would know about or that they would publicize. Well, good. All right. Thank you very much.